Hey guys, it's Justin with Shock Therapy once again, and we are here to show you how to install a dual rate spring kit for a Honda 1000X. Due to the fact that the Hondas are extremely stiff, especially in the back of the car factory, this spring kit is going to plushen up the ride quality tremendously. It will stop a lot of the rear bucking and a lot of the chatter and chop that comes through the chassis and into your gas foot, bouncing it off the pedal. This spring kit is a giant change over the factory ride quality that is existent in the OEM springs. This spring kit is a very easy installation and should take no more than 1 or 2 hours. So let's go ahead and take a look at the parts that are included in the kit on the workbench. So on the bench to my left is a complete coil spring kit for a 1000X. Included in the kit are 8 coil springs, 2 front uppers, front lowers, rear uppers, and rear lowers. As always, these coil springs will come marked as to where they're located on the car so that you can't make a mistake and put them in the wrong spot. Also included in the kit are crossover rings. There are 2 crossovers per shock, 8 crossovers total. You also get 4 silent crossover O-rings that eliminate the sound as the slider contacts the crossover. As always, we recommend that you lay out all of the components in the kit in advance. This helps with the installation, as well as making sure that all of the parts are included in the kit that should be. Now that we've seen this kit, let's go ahead and go over to Steve and have him show us how to put this kit on.
Step 1 is to jack the front of the car up off the ground and install jack stands. Next, remove the hood to gain access to the upper shock bolts. Loosen the upper shock bolts and save the hardware. Loosen the lower shock bolts and remove them. With the hardware loosened, you can now remove the shock from the vehicle. Do this one at a time, as the front shocks are side-specific. Do not mix them up from side to side. The springs are marked upper and lower. Make sure you set aside the springs that are for the front shocks. Using a spring compressor of your choice, compress the spring so that you have access to the lower spring perch clip. Remove this clip to allow you to remove the lower spring perch. Remove the factory springs, but save the factory spring divider. It will be used on the new spring kit. With a shock in the vise, break the preload collars loose with a hammer and screwdriver. With the preload collars loose, you can now set the new preload measurement. The tape measure should be butted against the black head of the shock and measuring to the bottom of the preload nut. This measurement in the front should be 2 3/8 of an inch. Once the preload collar is set, you can lock it in place. Next, you can install the crossover rings. These rings have a flat surface and a recessed surface. The flat surfaces touch each other, so make sure that when you install the crossover rings, they're on correctly, with the flat surfaces touching each other and the recessed surfaces facing the top and bottom of the shock. With the tape measure butted against the head of the shock, crossover ring should be set at 6.5 inches. This measurement is to the bottom of the crossover ring that faces the bottom of the shock. Once they're set, you can lock them in place. Install the silent O-ring for the crossovers. Roll it down the shock into the recessed surface of the bottom crossover ring. Install the upper spring first in our spring kit. Next, install the black plastic spring divider with the long end facing the bottom of the shock. Now install the lower spring. Make sure that the ends of the springs, where they contact the black divider, are touching the divider on the opposite sides of each other, 180 degrees from each other. With the springs clocked correctly on the divider, compress them and install the lower spring perch. Install the spring perch retainer clip. Make sure that it's in the groove properly. If it is not completely in the groove, the retainer ring and lower spring perch will not remain on the shock. Loosen the spring tension and get ready to install the shock back on the car. Install the shock using the upper bolt first. Leave all hardware loose, until the end of this installation so that we can make sure that the ride heights are correct. Repeat these steps for the opposite front shock. With both shocks installed back on the car and the hardware left loose, you can remove the jack stands and put the car back on the ground. Next, raise the rear of the car off the ground and install jack stands. Loosen the rear shock hardware. Remove the lower shock bolt first. Remove the shock from the car. Make sure that you do one shock at a time, as they are also side specific. Once the shock is removed and on the bend, make sure the springs that are left over are the upper and lower for the rear shocks. Using the spring compressor, compress the spring package so that you have access to the lower spring perch. Remove the spring perch retaining clip. With the clip removed, you can slide the spring perch with rock guard off of the shock. Release the pressure on the spring package and remove the springs, but save the plastic divider. With the shock in the vise, you can break loose the preload collars. Set the new preload measurement for the rear shocks. The tape measure should be butted up against the head of the shock, measuring to 2 5/8 of an inch to the bottom of the preload collars. With this measurement set, lock the preload collars in place. Install the crossover rings on the shock. Remember, they have a flat surface that touches each other and a recessed surface that faces either end of the shock. The crossover ring measurement in the rear is 7 3/4 of an inch. The tape measure should be butted against the head of the shock. With this measurement set, lock the rings in place. Install the silent crossover O-ring. Install the new upper spring and factory plastic divider. Install the lower spring. Make sure that the spring ends touch the plastic divider on opposite sides. Compress the system and install the lower spring perch with rock guard. Before you install the lower spring perch, the lower loop of the shock has a recessed notch taken out of it. Make sure that when you're installing the lower spring perch, that these two items line up perfectly. Install the lower spring perch retainer clip. Release pressure on the spring package while making sure that the lower spring perch is lined up with the lower loop of the shock in the correct indentation. Install the rear shock back on the car, starting with the upper hardware. Install the lower hardware, making sure that all of the hardware is left loose for later on in the installation. Repeat these steps on the opposite side. You can now remove the jack stands and drop the car on the ground. It's now time to check ride heights. All ride heights should be checked with someone in the car. If you don't have a friend that can run around in the car for you, find somebody else that can help. The car must be settled before you can measure ride heights. You cannot just simply jump up and down on the car or the bumpers to settle the suspension. It must be driven around the block, or at the very least, back and forth in the driveway using the brakes to settle the suspension. Once you've done this 2 or 3 times, come to a rolling stop without hitting the brakes. The front ride height should be 13 inches off the ground. This is measured from the rear lower control arm mounting tab to the ground. The rear of the car should be 12.5 inches off the ground. This is measured from the rear skid plate directly to the ground. Now it's time to check the crossover heights. The crossover heights should be approximately 2.5 inches of gap between the bottom of the crossover and the top of the black spring divider in the rear. The crossover gap on the front of the car should be 1.5 inches from the bottom of the crossover to the black divider. Once your ride heights and crossovers are checked and perfect, you can tighten all of the shock hardware. All shock hardware is 12mm and should be torqued to 95 foot-pounds. The reason we leave the hardware loose is to make it easier to adjust the ride heights. If you find that your car sits too high or too low, you can adjust the preload collar accordingly to lift or lower the car. Some people like to remove the shock completely to adjust this. You can also do it on the car, especially if you have extra people to help you. With the front and rear hardware tightened and torqued, you can install the hood and lock the latches. Make sure that the front of the hood is hooked into its retaining mechanism, or you'll lose the hood the first time you drive the car.
Thank you, Steve, for showing us how to install the springs on that car, and we hope that the installation went just as easy for you as it did for Steve. A few things to remember when it comes to the spring kit, especially since it's brand new. All of our spring kits are made in the USA and they are warranted for life. They will take a set over the first 1 to 300 miles. Once they've settled that one time, they won't settle again. So, just as you've checked the ride height on this new installation, we want you to recheck those ride heights after some time on the car. Give it some time to settle in the first time, recheck those, change the ride height accordingly, and it'll stay that way for the life of the car. Remember though, most people don't ever think about the accessories that they add to their car. You can add 200 to 300 pounds to the car and not even remember that you've done it. So, from time to time, just check the ride height here and there and make sure that the accessories you've added haven't lowered the car excessively, because you can raise it up and bring the ride quality right back. If you enjoy the improvement of this spring kit over factory, you're really going to enjoy the internal modifications and improvements it gives you above and beyond the spring. When you're ready to get the inside of the shock modified, let us know. If you want a night and day difference, have us do the internal shock work for the pinnacle of ride quality in a 1000X. If you have any other questions involving this product or any others that we offer for the Honda or other cars, contact us at 623-217-4959 or at shocktherapist.com.